We get a little insight into what made Barnabas the kind of encourager that he was in Acts chapter 11. We read there a description of one of those moments when Barnabas encourages some of the believers up in the city called Antioch. There in that chapter we learn that some great things have been happening up there, and so the apostles, the leaders, the church in Jerusalem decided to send somebody like a Barnabas up to check into what was going on and hopefully to encourage the folks that were there. What is written there describes some of those characteristics of Barnabas that we do well to pay attention to. One of the things that stands out in all of that is just his capacity to see what's going on and to see God's hand at work in it. We read that in verse 23, but Barnabas is somebody who perceives God's grace at work there. Read in verse 23, when Barnabas arrived and he saw the evidence of the grace of God, he was glad. He saw something that God was doing there, and he rejoiced at it. He celebrated it. He was able to draw attention to it, to point people to it. That's part of what fuels our capacity to encourage other people, is to see God's grace and God's power and God's handiwork in our midst, and then to draw other people's attention to it, to point them to how God is at work in the situations around us. Another thing that we learned there about Barnabas was that he was somebody who was full of the Holy Spirit. We read that in verse 24, the first part of that verse. He was a good man, we're told, and he was full of the Holy Spirit. Interestingly, the words used to describe Barnabas when we're told his nickname in Acts chapter 4, and the word that Jesus used to describe the ministry of the Holy Spirit when he was telling the disciples about what the Holy Spirit would do, are the same word. It's a compound word. It brings together two root words there that literally mean alongside of and to come alongside, to call alongside. It's somebody who is called alongside someone else to be a source of strength and help and encouragement, to be an advocate to them, to be a helper to them, to be somebody who can bring them comfort in difficult times. It's all of that and more. And I don't think it's an accident that the word used to describe the ministry of the Holy Spirit and the word used to describe someone like a Barnabas who's an encourager, who was full of the Holy Spirit, are the same. If we're indwelt by and filled by the presence and the power and the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives, that Spirit does His work through us in the lives of others. We also learn something more about Barnabas, though, in Acts chapter 11, right after that notation about his being full of the Holy Spirit. We're told as well that he was full of faith, the capacity to see what cannot be seen in the moment. To effectively encourage someone, an encourager has to be able to see, in a sense, not only the present circumstances, but also what God could do. And to be able to see that with a sense of confidence and encouragement and assurance about what the future could be. And to be able to point someone else to what that could become. To be able to be the person who can enable people to see what can happen with a sense of confidence. An encourager is all of those things. Someone who can see God's presence at work in the circumstances. Somebody who's full of the Holy Spirit so that the ministry of the Holy Spirit is lived out in the lives of others. And somebody who's full of faith. Someone who can see what can become in those kind of situations. I'm reminded of a couple of different situations that enable us to see with a sense of vividness, kind of that encouragement at work. One of them is a situation involving some miners a number of years ago, back in what has now been called the Miracle at Quay Creek. It was a coal mine in Pennsylvania back in 2002, when miners were trapped some 240 feet underground in a water-filled mine shaft. This group of miners had to decide what they were going to do to be able to live, to be able to survive what was there. The 55-degree water threatened to kill them slowly by hypothermia. So according to the news reports, when one would get cold, the other 8 miners would huddle around that person and warm them up. And then when another of the miners would get cold, the other 8 would return the favor, would come around him and warm him up as well. Miner Harry Mayhew told reporters after being released from the hospital after getting out of the mine that everybody had strong moments, but any certain time maybe one guy got down and then the rest pulled together. And that guy would get back up and maybe everyone else would feel a little weaker, and it became a team effort, and he said that's the only way that it could have been. They faced incredibly hostile conditions together, and they all came out alive together. In some ways, I think that's a picture of what it is for God's people to be walking through these days, together, to be the ones who are encouraging one another and building one another up, and even more so as that day approaches. There's another lady, though, in Chicago, Illinois, who captures that idea of what it means to be a Barnabas to others. Her name is Betty Tucker. She's a cook, and she's a Christian who works at Children's Memorial Hospital in Chicago, Illinois. She's been doing her job as a cook there for 43 years, 28 of those years on the night shift. In the course of her role as a cook on the night shift, she sees a steady stream of parents, some of them frightened and weary because of the circumstances that their children are facing. Chicago Tribune featured her in an article a number of years ago, and on the particular night that the reporter was shadowing her during her shift, Miss Betty served food to a mother whose 3-year-old fell out of a second-story window that morning, another mother whose 17-year-old was battling a rare form of leukemia, and a third mother whose 18-year-old had endured 7 hours of brain surgery that day. You can get a sense for the kind of circumstances that the people who see Miss Betty are facing. But she says it breaks her heart, but that's why she's there. And she's there to feed up not just some food for them as a part of that, but some words of encouragement. One coworker that was interviewed for the article said this. So that's why she feeds every last one of them as if they had walked right into the too small kitchen of her South Side bungalow where she lives. Another member of the hospital's housekeeping crew adds this about Miss Betty. You need someone to bring you life in the middle of the night, and she brings it. Miss Betty's just that kind of person. If you see Miss Betty's picture, you'll see the smile that she brings to each parent or each child who is looking for some hope in the midst of the desperation, in the midst of the darkest part of the night. It's hard to imagine what that smile would mean to a suffering parent or child. Miss Betty says, when I ask, how you doing today, and they say it's not a good day, I say, don't lose hope. And when the nurses tell me it's a bad night, I say, I understand it's a bad night, but guess what? I'm here for you. I'm going to get you through the night. All of us have those points in our lives when we need a Miss Betty there to bring us hope in the midst of the darkest part of the night. She, when interviewed for the article, she said, look, I'm a praying lady. She said, I pray every night for every room and every person in the hospital. I start with the basement, and I go up floor by floor, room by room. I pray for the children. I pray for the families. I pray for the nurses and the doctors. I say every night while I'm driving in on the expressway, oh, Lord, I don't know what I'll face tonight, but I pray that you'll guide me through. And Miss Betty is the one that the Lord uses to guide others through the darkest part of the night, through the great desperation. She is the voice, the smile, the presence in that kitchen in Children's Memorial Hospital that gets not just the parents, but the nurses and the other staff through the darkest and desperate parts of the night. She's that 66-year-old grandmother in the middle of the triathlon who brings the word that keeps the runner going when the running seems the toughest. It challenges us and it inspires us. It raises the question about the degree to which we are that indeed for each other. The degree to which we're more like Miss Betty than we are like that complaining guy who just drags everybody else down. When you think of the encounters and the circumstances that you've been through in the last week, have you been an encourager for other people? Have you been a Barnabas? Have you been someone who comes alongside and gets them through the toughest times? Or have you been somebody that hasn't helped a whole lot? We're called to be a Barnabas. We're called to be a Miss Betty. We're called to be those miners who gather around the others. This week, let's consider what that means for what we need to say and what we need to do for each other as we seek to encourage one another, and even more so as we see the day approaching. That's it, Jadis. Keep it up, dude. That's it, Nate. You can make it. Come on, let's get the goal.